Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome back to Missions Pulse, where we encourage you to know God's heart and join His mission. For all you culture junkies out there, I know you're a lot of you guys are culture junkies, or at least you're following these kind of current trends in Western society, and they're serious, hot topics, right? We're talking about war and race, gender, politics, and in light of eternity, we'll call these passing or fleeting. However, man, they are a big part of our lives, and they have been for as long as we can go back in history, for millennia. People have been wrestling with how do we respond to the culture wars, you might call them, of the past, and presently we're dealing with the same thing. In light of eternity, though, once we pass beyond this veil of space and time, once we see God's biggerness, we're going to realize that these are the infinitesimal things. However, right now, we're dealing with them. And what better person, there's no better person, I think, than someone who's kind of has a pulse on what's taking place in culture and these different trends and issues that are going on. Let me introduce to you Karen Swallow-Prior. She's a PhD and research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author of Booked, Literature for the Soul of Me, 2012, Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Poet, Reformer, Abolitionist, that was 2014, and On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, that was 2018. She's also the co-editor of Cultural Engagement, Crash Course in Contemporary Issues, came out in 2019, and has contributed to numerous other books. Also, by the way, her writing has appeared in Christianity Today, The Atlantic, Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Relevant, Think Christian, The Gospel Coalition, Religion News Service, Culture, Books and Culture, and other places. By the way, she's also the host of the popular podcast Jane and Jesus. That just dropped recently. We're going to get into that. She's a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education, senior fellow at the L. Russ Bush Center for Faith and Culture, and is a former member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Humane Society of the United States. She and her husband live in a 100-year-old homestead in Central Virginia with sundry horses, dogs, and chickens. Oh, and a lot of books. Hey, Karen, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think I picked the long version of your bio.
Yeah, that was a little much. I'm exhausted just listening.
I think I said it too fast. I'm short of breath, man. I was hoping you're going to take over from here. No. Well, I've just been following you for some time on social media, on Twitter, and so excited to have you on here. This has been, I think, in waiting while we booked this a number of months back, and man, here we are. Happy to be with you.
I'm so glad to be here and hear more about your ministry and hopefully encourage your listeners.
Yes, well, I think you will, and first and foremost, let's do a little funny, weird game, okay? A lot of people follow you on social media. Maybe they know you vicariously through your tweets, but let's give them a little bit more. I'm going to ask you a short question. You answer with just a quick answer, okay? And then I'll give you more time to expound if you're like, why in the world did he ask me that? Real quick, get to know Karen Swallow-Prior. All right, here we go. You ready?
I hope so.
Yes. I hope so too. Okay. 3 adjectives that describe you.
Snarky. Snarky.
You can't stop there.
Bookish.
Okay.
And hopefully kind.
Good. Yeah, I see that. Snarky. I like how you started with that one. What's your favorite spot in America that you've ever been to?
My house, my home. I love my home. I just, it's my favorite place. But probably the favorite place I visited is Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Ooh, cool. Okay. The first answer gives us definitely a little more into who you are as a personality. What is your favorite food?
Salad.
Okay.
I love salad.
There's a wide array. We'll just leave it at that. Cat or dog person?
Dog.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
All right. That's why we're friends. Jane Austen or Jesus?
Oh, wow.
I had to ask that question.
Jesus, of course, but Jane loves Jesus. So,
Okay. All right. Phew. I had to make that reference to your new podcast, which we'll hopefully talk about here soon. People can check it out, by the way, janeandjesus.substack.com, or just Google it. You'll find it. Your favorite female Bible character in the Bible and why?
I'm going to say Eve. And the reason why, well, there are a lot of reasons why, but I think Eve is a subject in a lot of literature. And so I think even just she's come alive to me beyond the pages of the Bible, especially like in John Milton's Paradise Lost. And there's just so much complexity to her character and her decisions and the outcome. She's just an interesting character.
Yeah. When you describe her like that, it really reminds me of. Have you read much of George MacDonald, Scottish pastor poet?
Yeah, I know who he is, but I have not read. I don't read much fantasy.
Okay, yeah, it's he often writes. There's always a wise woman in a white gown walking through the forest, Lilith, fantasies, and it always just is very Evishness to his characters. So I kind of see that as well. All right. What about your favorite male Bible character and why?
I don't think we always think of him as a character, but he is, and I'm going to say John, because he is a character in the sense that he is one of the disciples, but he's also like a writer. He's an amazing writer. His books are some of my favorite books in the Bible, so awesome. I love him.
Cool. All right. What is your favorite historical Christian missionary?
Oh, let's see. I did.
There's too many to choose from. I know.
Yeah. When I think about missionaries, can I cheat a little bit?
Yeah. It's missions polls.
Okay,
I guess so.
Okay. It's not a historical one.
Oh,
so
okay.
when I think of a missionary, honestly, it's probably cheating in the other way too. But I think of my husband, who's a public school teacher. Public schools in our America are under a lot of fire these days, a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and they get a lot of criticism. And I think a lot of people don't realize how many good Christian people are serving in a way that really is a lot like being a missionary. So in a way that's, so I know that's not what you meant, but I like to think about missions that way. So
we'll go with the Charles Spurgeon, you're either a missionary or an imposter. So there you have it. Okay. Best quote ever.
Be yourself. Everyone else is taken, by Oscar Wilde.
Ooh, cool. Okay. And lastly, the top 2 books that have impacted your life.
The top one is probably Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, the 19th century French novel about a romantic woman whose life was ruined, really. And she ruined it herself because she she had so many romantic ideas that she couldn't really make much out of the real world around her and ruined her life. And then I would say Jane Eyre is just a longtime favorite and a character and a story that I think just really spoke to me, and it continues to speak to me, not just in being a woman, but even simply being a Christian in the modern world and trying to maintain my faith with integrity.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Okay, well, on that note, those are just snippets. Why don't you catch people up about your story? How did you come to faith? How did you come into this space where you are now?
Well, I was very blessed to be born into a Christian home where my parents really became serious Christians when I was young. So all of my memories are growing up in church and accepting Christ at a young age, being baptized at a young age. And I also just always loved stories and books. My mom read to me. I always had my nose in a book. And so those two worlds just kind of, those were my two worlds, is church and books. And I actually didn't see how they really could be reconciled. They were sort of compartmentalized, and I didn't know how to reconcile them really until I was in my PhD program, because I didn't grow up knowing or realizing that the life of the mind could be something that could be a way to worship God and glorify Him and serve the church. I'll say this. I think this might be of interest to you and your listeners, of being in a missions organization. I grew up at a time when the message that I received from the church was that if I really loved God, then I would be willing to be a missionary in some, strange foreign land. That might be what he would call me to, or if or a pastor's wife. Since I was a girl, I wasn't going to be a pastor. So people who really loved God became pastors or missionaries. And that made me angry and resentful because I didn't feel called to those things. And so it just took a long, long time for me to do reading and exposure. But first really kind of rejecting the Christian life, because I thought that those were the options in front of me, and they weren't. I didn't feel called to them. And so I thought I would pursue academia and kind of apart from him. And it wasn't until I realized that I could serve the Lord and serve the church through that calling that it all sort of came together.
That compartmentalization, I think that you're talking about, the boxiness of how we often describe serving God, right? Eugene Peterson, the author of the Message Bible, he talks about long obedience in the same direction. I think it looks differently for different people, right? You could sell everything and put it into a coffin and float away to the far off Orient and become a hero of sorts, a legend. Or you continue that long obedience in the same direction wherever you are. And geographical boundaries don't really determine your obedience and faithfulness to God.
Right. Geographical borders, or even the borders of time, right? The place, the time that God put us in sovereignly. The time in history, which is something I remind myself a lot as we're facing difficult days in the church. This is what God called us to.
Gospel Privilege provides the keys you need to unlock your full potential as an effective witness of God's kingdom power. This resource will inspire change in you as you read testimony after testimony of people who use their gospel privilege to bring the kingdom message worldwide. As author David Joannis testifies, gospel privilege is the soul-saving, culture-shaping, world-changing message that's come into the world through the person of Jesus. It is an unearned spiritual advantage with eternal consequences meant for every human being. Buy the book on Amazon or visit gospelprivilege.com to download a free chapter today.
On that note, you do write a lot about these hot topics. I mean, I'm pretty. You're bold. You're bold in your writing. I wish I could
stupid.
Well, yeah. I won't put any percentages out. But the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, SBTS, where you working presently, yes. The website gives this depiction about you. Okay. She writes frequently on literature and cultural issues. Amongst other things, a long thing. It says she writes frequently on literature and cultural issues. And as you think about this wide array of cultural issues, what are some of your favorite literary or cultural issues you like to address?
Well, I think, and I do write a lot about a lot of issues, and sometimes it does feel like I'm sort of all across the board. And I believe strongly that, we have lanes and we should kind of stick to them, that we're all called to certain things and not to everything. So that sort of contradicts the way I write about so many topics, but my love of literature and my life of reading have made a lot of different issues important to me, and I think what they all have in common really is what it means to be human, um, and human beings made in God's image, and what it means to be human beings in a certain, as we've already mentioned, time and place that we are called to and called to live out faithfully. And so that's, I think, where my passion for addressing a lot of the hot button issues of the day comes from, because underneath them all, I'm vocal about abortion, and I'm vocal about, I've been an activist for a long, long time before becoming a professor in that area. I'm very passionate about just the human condition, marriage, sexuality, all of the things that are what make us human, and the way that God designed us. So all of these issues, in one way or another, really do, they stem from those foundational questions.
When you describe them, they suddenly, as you describe them as very human, they really aren't or don't need to be hot topics. They're the most natural of topics as humans created in God's image. And yet they've become those hot buzz topics. But what I wanted to ask you, because this is a podcast called Missions Pulse, and I am kind of looking at this, perhaps recording here from Thailand in a global sphere. So I wanted to ask you this. How do America's contemporary issues like war, race, creation care, gender, politics, you just mentioned some of them, impact the world at large? Or I guess I should ask it like this. How do these hot topics in current Western culture impact the global missionary enterprise or the world at large?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something I think I'm really just starting to understand as a Christian, born and raised in America, and just sort of making a lot of assumptions about that, and not thinking beyond my own experience, even though I think we all think we do. But America is, everything that we do has an effect around the globe as a country, and certainly as a church. Yet at the same time, especially when we talk about the church, evangelicalism, and the gospel and various movements of the church are flourishing around the globe.
That's true. Yeah.
In ways that they aren't right now in America. And so that should humble us and teach us and encourage us. And so there's this tension, I think, that America is the world power. Everything that we do, economically and domestically, has an effect around the world. Even just the way we consume goods and the way that we live our everyday lives and the phones that we use, all of those things are so interconnected to what's happening around the globe. And I don't think we see it as much in our relationship with the church universal, the whole body. And I think we aren't as willing to learn from our brothers and sisters in countries that really, where the church is flourishing, but the people have far less, freedom and material goods than we have. And so I think that, I'm certainly not an expert in all of these issues that you named. These are ones that we, in my book, Cultural Engagement, we brought a lot of different Christian voices in to talk about. And regardless of the issue, I think, first of all, wherever we are as Christians, we start with scripture, and we're accountable to the church. And yet, no matter our time and place, we need to think through these things biblically, but also as a body, not just think as American Christians or evangelical Christians, right? But think about, well, what is the rest of the body around the world saying and doing? What's happening there? And we do that so badly. I do that so badly. We get caught up in these issues, as we should. We need to, be concerned with what's happening in our own communities and our own churches. And yet in doing that, we forget that some of the issues that we are so consumed by aren't even on the radar screen for our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world.
I think that's well spoken. And I guess maybe one of the reasons I wanted to ask you that is because, I've been living outside my country of birth, America, for 24 years now. And I see missionaries coming short term, long term, all the time. Well, minus COVID and pre COVID. And inevitably, people take their cultural baggage, their background, their experience, their understanding and perception of what evangelicalism or Christianity is to them. And rightly so. How else do you understand it? But it does so affect, especially when you're so polarized in a particular lane or thought process. When you come to the field and you're talking to people who don't even share the same idea with you, there's a major disconnect. And do we have a tendency, that is, to make these, I don't want to call them minute or small. They're not, but there is a biggerness, a macro picture, a broader sense around the world of what God's doing. And I think, is there a danger in kind of exporting American issues around the world?
Yeah, I mean, as being here as opposed to somewhere else, I don't know those dangers. I can only, I see them more from the reverse angle, in that we are putting too much focus and emphasis on them. We are dividing ourselves, dividing our congregations, and even, just misrepresenting one another on social media and acting unchristlike on many issues that are, as I said, aren't even in the minds of people around in the church around the world.
Yeah.
But that's why I love culture. I mean, because God created culture, right? I mean, human beings create culture, but he created the idea of culture. He's the one who put us on in this world to experience this earth, that's pre the new heaven and the new earth. He could have skipped this step entirely, right? He could have just made human beings in his image to live with him in eternity,
Yeah.
and skipped this part of it, but he didn't. And so we are called to particular cultures and times and places. And so again, that tension of being faithful in those times and places and dealing with those things that are in front of us, yet at the same time keeping that eternal perspective in mind, and that global church perspective in mind. It's really challenging and humbling.
We have a bunch of career opportunities for you to serve at Within Reach Global. Open positions include web developer, social media manager, graphic designer, short-term missions director, and more. We want to help you discover your unique God-given calling to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Help give gospel access to people who have never heard of Jesus before. Go to withinreachglobal.org and click go.
Absolutely. And everywhere you go, my experience in China, that ethnocentrism of Americans is very similar in all these countries. China has their own ethnocentrism, or China, the view through the lens of Chinese culture, and so on. So I think that's a great answer, and we need to catch the biggerness. I kind of want to shift gears here a little bit, because I recently was just reading your article. It was called "Beth Moore Left the SBC After the SBC Left Women to Fend for Themselves." Ouch title. Did you come up with that yourself?
Oh, I don't write the titles. No,
Oh, you
I
don't?
don't even
Okay.
remember that was the title.
Well, I wanted to talk about women in ministry. And I know you had this great article, and this is what you read. I'm going to just read a wrote. This is a quick excerpt. It said, "The church needs women who are seminary trained. The church needs women teaching in seminaries. The church needs women to minister to the world through academic appointments in secular institutions. The church needs women to serve in these ways, just as it needs women who are missionaries, mothers, teachers, servants, leaders, and friends. Women in the church don't need a room of their own as much as the church needs both women and men in the room." What were you getting at there? And tell me a little bit more about your heart for women in the ministry.
Well, this entire article and that passage in particular arises out of a very, of this moment American controversy within
Sure.
my own denomination. It's not really a global issue or a church universal issue that I'm speaking to. It's simply that because belong to a denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, that believes that men are to be pastors and men are the ones to preach the word. That's what we believe. And yet a lot of sort of extra applications have been being made about that in terms of what other things women can or cannot do. And so basically, what I'm trying to point out is that that women can do ministry in so many other ways, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
we are all supposed to be ministering or missionaries, to go back to our earlier part of our conversation. And so a lot of people use the term ministry in a very broad way, which I think it is a broad term. But when we talk about women in ministry, my initial response to a phrase like that is like, well, we're all supposed to be in ministry.
Sure. Yeah, it's a silly
And
question,
so,
really.
but then when people talk about, well, are they there's some irony here too, because as I said earlier, I didn't see myself and resisted as a young Christian the idea of being in full-time ministry. In that way that we use that, because the only two options I saw were being a pastor or pastor's wife or a missionary. And I've always seen myself as someone called to kind of the secular world, called to be a bridge between that world and the world of the church. And yet all of my, or most of my adult life, I have spent serving, in Christian education, being paid by Christian ministries. And so as a professor, I'm in ministry. And so there are so many more ways that women can be in ministry. And yet we have so much division and debate over this one particular role. And because we have that debate about that, we're debating all these other things that are entirely not only legitimate, but necessary for women to do. So I was trying to speak into that.
Yeah. Well, on that line, surrounding all these, you call them theological, social issues going on in the SBC or surrounding the SBC. What makes you, because I read recently, you're unabashedly claiming that your stance as a member of the denomination, you speak of it just now, you own it, you're unashamed. What are the positive aspects? What is the reason why you claim to be a Baptist or Southern Baptist member?
Oh, so many reasons. I mean, first of all, my basic theology aligns best with, a Baptistic theology in terms of, believers' baptism and baptism by immersion. And then some of the other Baptist distinctives like soul competency and religious liberty. Religious liberty is a big one for me because my area of expertise is modern British literature, so 17th, 18th, 19th century literature, which happens right in that time when England was sorting out its sort of newly emerging religious liberty across the ocean here in America. People were settling and not necessarily in favor of religious liberty for other people. So we have this long history of religious intolerance and lack of liberty, and Baptists are the ones who, not the only ones, but Baptists really, that this is one of our strengths throughout history, is believing in religious liberty, which I think is so important around the world today. And so then being Southern, I grew up in the North where we didn't have a lot of Southern Baptist churches at that time. But when I moved to the South, I looked specifically for a Southern Baptist church because I knew at that time, in the midst of sort of all the culture wars and many denominations going in a more liberal direction, the Southern Baptist Convention was going in a more conservative one. Now we've seen some of the ugly underside of that movement of late, and that's a hard thing to own and to reckon with. But we're called to that too. I mean, I don't know of a church denomination that doesn't have some sort of sin and or structural problem. I think ultimately we have to decide. The bigger question is, do we believe in church institutions and church bodies that can hold each other accountable and hold us accountable? And ultimately, I do. I think that even if people choose a different denomination, they're not going to escape any of these problems. And the real question is, we are not made to just worship in isolation on our own. We're to be part of a body. And so the Southern, so I guess I'm Southern Baptist because God called me to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your voice. That explores other. Should I call you like a female Joe Rogan-esque kind of individual? You seem to be one who is able to have conversations with differing opinions and bring all things to the table and explore. And I've just kind of noticed that about you. I appreciate it.
I love to learn. I love to listen. I love to think. So I have a hard time understanding people who are threatened by that.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to call you a Joe Rogan. That was not planned.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I don't know a lot about him, but a little bit I do know. I'm like, well, I don't know.
Bad representation. I just slipped out.
I understand what you're saying, though.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, as we're talking about these things, the issues that we grew up in, the framework, the construct of Christianity within our own cultures, deconstructionism has become a term that has risen to popularity as of late, I guess you could say. You probably know more if it was more popular in recent decades, but today, it's entered the Christian vernacular and is on the forefront of Christian conversation. What are your thoughts about this, deconstructing one's faith?
Well, as you're right, that term has been around for a long time. It's one that comes from my particular field of literary criticism, and it means something very different. So it took me a while to just settle with the fact that, okay, it's come to mean something else in this context.
You're kind of one of those people, right, who knows that words change, but you want to hold on to the initial definition.
You've got me pinned. That's exactly it.
Like evangelicalism.
Yes. I want that history. I want that dictionary definition. But yes, unfortunately, words do change meanings and take on, and that's fun too. But deconstruction. It began, I think, as a movement to describe people who were abandoning the faith, part of the ex-evangelical movement or even ex-Christian movement. And so that gives it a lot of negative connotations, and a lot of people are concerned. But it's evolved, like the word, into something else, that a word that some people are using to describe sort of the dismantling of their old assumptions and even false teachings that they grew up with and never questioned in the church. And so I think the best way to think about the word deconstruction and the movement is to understand that it's a word that has an object, and the way we have to know what's being deconstructed before we can determine whether it's something that's healthy or unhealthy or good or bad, and we also don't even know what the outcome will be. So if people are deconstructing or dismantling faulty assumptions and teachings and intertwinings of cultural Christianity with actual biblical Christianity, then that's what we need to do. And I think we're seeing a lot of it now because I grew up before this, so I'm actually thankful to be a little bit older, but I've been in Christian education for a long time, for decades. So I have taught many, many young people who grew up in the culture wars or post-culture wars era, and their faith is so connected to political parties and parachurch organizations and teachings from books that may not be that great, or from celebrity leaders, but they grew up so immersed in that for them, that is what Christianity was or is. And so for them to kind of figure out, no, these are the cultural trappings. That's not what biblical Christianity is, universally and globally. Then it's a painful process for them, but one that for many, I think, is necessary. And it can lead, and I've seen it lead to a more pure biblical faith. Of course, the ones that make the headlines are the ones who are just rejecting, they're throwing out the baby and the bathwater, and we don't want that. But this is the moment we are in church history in America, especially because so much of Christianity in 20th and 21st century America has been tied to conferences and books and celebrities and movements and so many other things that are extra. Some of those things may be good and some may be bad, but they're not the essence of the faith.
A lack of gospel access is the greatest injustice known to humankind. We're looking for monthly donors who will help us combat gospel poverty by funding our locally led missions movements. When you give to Within Reach Global, you give gospel access to people who have never heard of Jesus before. Set up your monthly donation today at withinreachglobal.org/donate.
Yeah. As you're talking about that, you're obviously, I could have asked you the same question or similar question about the word evangelical or evangelicalism. I think there's a lot of similarities. It's also taken on a pejorative connotation. I long to kind of keep that traditional definition, dictionary definition you mentioned, because to me, in the global arena, maybe you can call it, evangelicalism is alive and well and thriving in parts of Brazil and South Korea and Kenya and all throughout, different parts of Asia and the world. So, but getting back, switching that from deconstructionism to evangelicalism, I want to talk to you about that. I just read a recent book. I'm sure you've read it too. Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, by Kristen Kobes-Dumez. Have you read that?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Yeah. I just finished it. She links the term to patriarchal authority, gender difference, Christian nationalism, amongst many others. And yet you and I are striving to align ourselves to this biblical definition of what it means to be an evangelical. Why should or shouldn't Christians attach themselves to this term evangelical?
Well, first, I just want to make the observation about this book because, it's a controversial book. I have some small issues with it. There have been some good criticisms written about it, but at the end of the day, the book is simply pointing to a certain stream, a very influential stream within American evangelicalism that is tied to sort of a hyper masculinity, and it's in a lot of different areas, and I don't think that really can be denied. Now, it's not the whole story, but it doesn't purport to be the whole story. It just says, hey, here is an influence that's been, significant in the last century in American evangelicalism. And for me, it kind of connected a lot of dots and explained a number of things. Is it the whole picture? No, it's not the whole picture. And I don't think it was pretending to be, but it does ask us, or I think demands us to grapple with some of these questions. We when we white Americans use the term evangelical, I think that we do tend to think about white American evangelicals, and that's wrong. Evangelicalism is much bigger, much broader, it's 300-year-old movement by David Bebbington's account, and it's now global and thriving. And will the word eventually become something that's so tainted that it serves no use? Possibly. But I still think that, for us to throw out the word is to also throw out the word that people around the globe are still using and in a positive way and growing because of it. So it's just, it's time for self-examination. And that's what this book offers us. And, we can, again, just like our deconstructionists, that we want to encourage not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Well, that's what we need to do as well. There's a lot of bathwater that is exposed in that book that we can get rid of and still keep the baby.
Yeah, I appreciate your fair assessment of that. I agree. I was reading it and I did like the book, but there were undertones you can't escape. I guess it was those discomfort and that wrestling with the reality of historical what has been taking place. And it was written very much from American context. And so
Right.
we already mentioned that. As we talk about all these things, we're talking about deconstructionism, evangelicalism, we're talking about women in ministry, talking about literature and arts and secular, the very blurry lines between secular and Christian. There's crossover in so many ways that are not compartmentalized. In light of all these things, in light of the great lostness of humankind, of gospel deprivation, you could call it, of many people around the world who have never even had a chance. I mean, for example, I've walked into villages in China and asked in Chinese, 你们这儿有没有听说过耶稣基督? Have you ever heard of Jesus here? And one guy said, 那是不是一种香皂的名牌? Is that a brand of a soap? I mean, he had no concept of
Wow.
who in the world Jesus was.
Wow.
And I live in Thailand. It's 0.77% Christian in this country after 194 years of Protestant evangelical missionary work. So I see this deprivation of the gospel. In light of that, in light of global lostness, what, in your opinion, should be our focal point of our evangelistic or missional or missionary efforts?
That's a big question.
Sorry to spring that
but
on
but no. But thinking about it again in our moment in history, and not just in America, but around the world, I think, and again, I've already mentioned that my area of study is 17th, 18th, 19th century British literature. So that's the period of expanding empire, colonialism, imperialism, and we're used to hearing a lot of the good that happened as a result of those things, especially in terms of missions and spreading the gospel. But there was a lot that was wrong too. A lot of fruit, bad fruit that we are bearing now because of wrong that was done during those years. So I think in this moment, when we talk about missions and we talk about bringing the gospel wherever it might be, whether it's to our next door neighbor or to, half a world away, we need to flip the paradigm that was used in, say 19th century British Empire. And we need to begin not with what we have to offer, because we really don't have anything to offer. It's Jesus that offers something. But we need to meet people where they are. We need to know what their needs are. Like that conversation that you just relayed. How foolish would it have been for you to just like hand out a tract to that man who'd never even heard of Jesus, right? Because that's not the starting point. You found out where his starting point was. And
he thought I was an international soap salesman trying to monopolize.
Right. And so you have to listen and not assume. You have to learn rather than impose. And I think that, as simple as that sounds, that is a huge paradigm shift from like 300 years of how we've tended to do missions and evangelization. And we still haven't really quite flipped that, but that's what I think we need to be more aware of.
Yeah, that learner's stance. I appreciate it. I think that's why I really wanted you to have you on Missions Pulse, because you're bringing this different dimension or paradigm. I think most of my guests are in missions somehow. They're overseas or something, but you bring a unique paradigm to this. Going back, by the way, you said, tell me again, your expertise is in 17th century?
It's 18th century.
18th, sorry.
But
18th.
because, we call it the long 18th century. So it basically is like from 1660 to, the middle of the 19th century. It's called the long 18th century because all the things that defined it extend both directions.
As an expert, this you just mentioned empires and colonialism, and I guess this is what I was wanting to touch on. I think this conversation's been great because it alludes to what we now know as, maybe you could call it, Christian nationalism, and what has dominated, our thoughts about what evangelical is and is not now. And this does affect the world tremendously. I see it regularly. And it's because we're caught in these paradigms or culture wars, and we're not quite sure what to do in the crosshairs. What would be your final encouragement for people who are in this position, right? They're probably in America. They're probably, no, I shouldn't say that. They're everywhere. They're everywhere, right? We all have our own unique issues that are on the forefront of our culture or table. What would be your final encouragement? And I didn't ask you this in advance, so again, spring it is on you.
I guess it would just be, and I'm thinking, as you ask that question, I'm thinking of some of the people I've interacted with who are so resistant to and defensive about these kinds of things. And I want to encourage people to adopt a posture of humility rather than defensiveness. I'll use the book Jesus and John Wayne as an example since we talked about it. Lots of people are upset with it, disagree with it, mad about it, or whatever. And that's fine. But why not, instead of saying this is wrong or I disagree or I don't see it this way, after saying that, say, well, but why would someone else see it this way? What would lead them to see it this way or view it that way? That is the humblest thing that we can do. And that is the Christ-like thing to do, is to just ask, what someone else's suffering or perspective is, rather than assume that ours is the only one. And I don't really know why that is so hard for people in this climate to do. Again, I think it's because there's so much defensiveness and fear. Or maybe it is really a lack of character. I don't know. Maybe there is a lack of that kind of humility. But for anyone who's struggling with feeling defensive, or maybe other people who are defensive when it comes to these conversations, just like encourage one another, encourage ourselves to say, well, why do you think this person sees it this way?
Yeah.
I mean, we all benefit when we ask those kinds of questions. We all increase our understanding. That doesn't mean agreement, but increased understanding of differences of point of view is can only help in our missions and our evangelization.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. I think that landing on this is the final touch, that humble posture to encourage people to take is a good one. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for taking the time to join me today, man. This has been a great conversation. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of your expertise and who you are. But I would just encourage people to follow you. In fact, how do people get in touch with you? You got a new podcast out, Jane and Jesus. Tell me more about that, and how can people follow you?
Well, Jane and Jesus is about Jane Austen and Jesus, but I have a wide variety of guests on who aren't even necessarily Christians. And so we talk about Jane Austen, but I also try to bring, the teachings of Jesus and the Bible into it. And it does, I hope, what I just talked about. It brings in other people's perspectives, and I get to listen to people who don't believe quite as I do about Jesus, but maybe we agree on Jane Austen. And so that's been, for me, that's an example of doing what I just have been talking about. And so people can listen to that. I'm on Twitter a lot. That's probably the easiest way to catch up with me. I have a website, KarenSwallowPryor.com. It's just where you can see some highlights of my work and my speaking schedule, which is just starting up again, I guess. We'll see how COVID goes. Still. Yeah.
Very good. Lastly, why are you the Notorious on Twitter?
That nickname was placed on me about 7 years ago, I think now. Wow, almost 7 years ago, when I came under sustained and deep attack by a few bloggers who, were accusing me of holding unorthodox and heretical views that I don't, but it's part of this whole culture wars mentality that we've been talking about. And
cancel her.
So I just stayed the course, and I guess people thought, I was notorious just for withstanding all that.
And now you own the title. Awesome.
Yes.
It's on your Twitter handle. It's not your handle, but in your name. Awesome. Well, hey, again, Karen, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been great. I appreciate this, and I'll continue to follow and stay in touch with what God's doing in and through your life.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay.
I'll see you out on Twitter.
Yes, ma'am. Take care.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.